Hello and welcome to Changing World. My name is Anthony Smith, and today I'm very pleased to have a new guest joining the show by the name of John Vespasian. Now, John is the author of 10 books about rational living, including such titles as The 10 Principles of Rational Living, Thriving in Difficult Times, Sequentiality, which is the amazing power of finding the right sequence of steps, and his latest work called Undisrupted, How Highly Effective People Deal with Disruptions. John has lived across Europe in countries such as Germany, Italy, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. His books combine his passion for history, investing, and personal development, reflecting his philosophy of rational living, productiveness, and respect for the individual. Here's a quote from John. "If you want to make good decisions, you have to look at the big picture and learn from the wisdom accumulated in centuries of human experience." After doing decades of research, John sums it all up with the following idea. It's all about learning from other people's successes and mistakes, and then figuring out how to apply those principles to your own life. So, welcome, John, and thanks very much for coming along today. How are you?
Hi, Anthony. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, John. Just to get the viewers a bit more familiar with who you are, I'd like to ask you, John, for the benefit of everyone listening, please could you tell us how you first got started in doing this particular type of research and what motivated you?
Yes, I started to write books about personal development. This very weird type of books because I mix history with personal development, with philosophy, practical philosophy, about 10 years ago. And the reason I started to write this kind of books is because I was very frustrated with the kind of books I was finding in the market. I've been reading books about personal finance, personal development for decades. And at a certain point, I was really extremely dissatisfied with the kind of advice, the kind of stories you can find in the market. Because most of them are very superficial, very fluffy, very feel-good kind of advice, but very unrealistic. And I started to write and to research the kind of books I could not find. It's very factual, very realistic. They are based on real people, on biographies. I tried to make very extensive research for each book. And the idea is to extract from history, from real stories, from real people, principles we can apply today in the 21st century to make better decisions. The underlying philosophy of the books, and I call it rational living, the underlying philosophy is very simple. If we can make our decisions a little bit better, I mean, we will never be perfect because we are not robots, and the idea is not to become a robot. But if you make your decisions a little bit better, if it's 1%, 2%, time after time, eventually it will have a massively positive effect on your life. You will improve a lot without having to have revolutionary changes in your life. And what I try to do by looking at history, in each book, I explore a different aspect of rational living. You just mentioned my latest book, Undisrupted. And what I have done in this book is to go through dozens of biographies in different centuries and try to extract the principles that make people very, very strong in the face of adversity.
Yes, that's a very interesting way of looking at things, of course, and a little bit original in the way you go about things. Now, I've been looking through a few of your the chapters in the book, and there are some really unusual material in there. I have in chapter 7, you talk about someone who fell out of a flying aeroplane and actually survived this and made a good recovery. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, these are stories of people. I have compiled this particular chapter to talk about extreme disruption. And there are several people, actually, if you look in history, there are several people who have survived after falling from an airplane. Some people during the war, actually during the Second World War. And the case I present in the book, which is one of the most recent, was a stewardess who survived the fall of 15 kilometers. She was flying from Copenhagen to Belgrade. She was Yugoslavian at the time. It was in the 1970s. And there was a terrorist attack, and the bomb exploded in the airplane, and all the other passengers and all the other members of the crew, they all died, and she survived. And she walked out of the hospital a few months later, completely recovered. These stories, they are very impressive because, I mean, how is this possible? Is it a miracle? Is it a miracle? And when people look in ancient history, they try to explain these coincidences in a magical way. But actually, when you look at dozens of biographies I have done in this book, you find this coincidence. And what happened to this woman? Her name was Vesna Vukovic. Well, she experienced a series of coincidences that were almost incredible, because when the bomb exploded, she was preparing drinks in the bar in the aircraft, so she was protected by a wall, and then she fell on top of a tree. So she went to the branches, and they slowed down the fall, and then she fell on 10 meters of snow. Soft snow that actually softened the shock. So eventually, she broke a few bones, but it was nothing serious. She was able to walk out of the airplane.
I see.
Now, the story is very impressive because this is amazing. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. What is very, very impressive, and this is why I put the story in the book, that even people who survive this kind of miraculous stories, they don't necessarily have an advantage, because when you look at the later years of Vesna Vukovic, and she came back to her job she returned to her job in the Yugoslavian Airlines, she didn't become super successful. Actually, she just went back to work in the airlines. They moved her to the cargo department because they didn't want to put her on a plane because people were very superstitious. And eventually she became a local celebrity, but she never made very much out of her life. And what I try to do in this book is to show how other people, many other people, I mean hundreds and hundreds of people, without having this amazing luck, they actually survive and they surmount major disruptions because they have the right strategy. The situations like Vesna Vukovic, they are very unusual. They draw attention, they make the headlines, but they don't provide the philosophy you can use in life, because in the end, she could have not done anything to prevent the accident. She just survived by pure chance. So I just wanted to show in this example that you cannot draw a principle or a philosophy out of that. It's just pure luck. It can happen to you. If you are so lucky to survive these kind of accidents, what you should try to do, obviously, is to try to make the best of your life every single day afterwards. Because when people go through disruptions, through major adversities, clever people become very time conscious, and they become super productive, super assertive. They become very successful. Because they actually figure out themselves how to grow out of the disruptions. In the case of Vesna Vukovic, it was luck from the beginning to the end, and she returned to being a stewardess.
Yes, well, that's an incredible story, John. You know, I can well understand why you put that in the book as something that you wouldn't believe anyone could possibly go through that and survive, and yet she did survive.
Yeah, Anthony, let me tell you. So I just wanted to underline in this story that you have to develop a philosophy. You have to develop the set of habits that will pull you successfully to these kind of disruptions. Now let me present another story, which is the opposite I wanted to convey. So Reinhardt, Django Reinhardt, was a very famous guitar player in the 1950s, 1940s. He suffered a very severe accident when he was in his 20s. He got burned because he was living in a van. He was a gypsy, and they didn't have electricity, so they were using candles for lighting. And during the night, the candle was overturned, and the whole van was on fire. So by the time he woke up, he was surrounded by a wall of fire, and he lost one of his fingers. He lost the use of one of his fingers. And if you play guitar, if you lose one finger, it's almost impossible to play. I mean, it's basically the end of your career. And the story is very interesting because Reinhardt, at the beginning, he was very depressed, like most people who get fired from a job, or they get divorced, or they lose their savings. He was very depressed for a couple of months. And then he adopted one of the main strategies I present in the book, which is the following. When people suffer this kind of accidents, this kind of disruptions, what you have to do is to look in history for examples of people who have surmounted similar problems. And in the case of Reinhardt, what he did was to try to find in history examples of people who could play the guitar, or they could play kind of instruments with physical deficiencies. So eventually he figured out that in previous centuries there were some performers who were injured, who had very different, very difficult situations, and they managed to play music very well by modifying the instrument or by modifying the way they played. So eventually Reinhardt figured out that if he could play faster, about 25% faster than usual, he would be able to play guitar with 9 fingers. He practiced for 5 months, and eventually he developed a style. It's very, very fast. If you listen to his music, it's incredibly fast. And he became extremely successful. Almost a few months later, he recorded his first album. He was on top of the charts for almost 10 years. And then he went to the U.S. and he toured the U.S. The Duke Ellington Orchestra. So he became extremely successful by applying one of the principles I present in the book, that when you are going through disruptions, you have to develop the right philosophy. You have to look at history. You have to look for positive reinforcement. And this is much more helpful than waiting for a miracle like Vesna Vulovic, because from Vesna Vulovic you cannot learn anything. But from people like Reinhardt, Django Reinhardt, you can really understand how to deal with adversity. Right.
Well, that's a very interesting and inspiring story there of someone who could have given up, but actually found a way to make things work again. So there again we have something which is, it's very encouraging to hear stories like that. Now there was another interesting story in the book which I'd like to pick up on. In chapter 12 of the book, you mention a desperately ill woman who turned her life around, and she took a decisive step. Obviously, she must have been very determined in what she wanted to do. Could you say a bit about that?
Yes, I have a chapter in the book about positive thinking and all the variations of healing that nowadays they are so fashionable, because you have gurus and you have healers, and you have all these kind of magicians in different countries. Every country has 2 or 3 of those. Well, in the U.S. you have many. And basically they promise people healing, or they promise people that they are going to turn their lives around if they become very positive, if they have a religious faith. And you have these promises all around. So in this book, in this chapter of the book, I analyze different cases to try to find the truth behind these healers, behind these promises. And the story of this woman we're discussing, her name was Mary Baker Eddy, and she was the founder of the Christian Scientists, which is a branch of Christianity. It has a few million, a rather large brand in the U.S., branch of Christianity. And they have around the world millions and millions of followers. And the basic idea of this branch of Christianity is that you can heal physically, you can heal other people with faith. And I found the story very intriguing to see what is behind, whether this kind of healing actually works as a way to deal with disruptions. And the story of Mary Baker Eddy is very interesting because she was very, very sick herself. She suffered when she was in his 40s. She fell and she had a spine injury, quite serious. And according to her own story, her own words, because she wrote a lot about her recovery, she opened the Bible and then she found the answer in the Bible, and then she recovered. Well, this is a typical healing story that you find so often on the internet, that people they become a different person when they read the Bible or they join some kind of religion. And it's very interesting to see that through the years, when Mary Baker Eddy she founded this branch of Christianity, she recruited a lot of followers. Because at the beginning she was working as a healer. She was advertising in the newspapers in Boston. She used to live in Boston. And she put advertisements trying to offer her services as a healer, as a religious healer. She got some success. And eventually she started to teach courses about Christian healing. And then she started really the religion. And nowadays you can see in this, they have newspapers and they have different publications. You can see that almost every week there is someone saying, "Oh, I've been healed from this and this sickness just because I joined this religion." This is not very different from what you see in other religions around the world, because in almost every religion you have this aspect of healing. Now, what is behind these stories, and to which extent can you rely on this kind of healing? Now, I went through the story, and I went also to other stories in this chapter of the book, and my conclusion is the following. There is very little magic behind these situations of healing. What is behind, in most cases, is a change of lifestyle, a very radical change of lifestyle. Because when people, they have most of these injuries, they have a psychosomatic element, because they have to deal with depression, with anxiety, with stress, which is really a very negative factor. So when people join these movements or they go to these healers, they are very hopeful of recovery, and then they determine to change their lives. And it happens very often when you look at the biographies of people joining the Christian Science, that they become very relaxed, they eliminate stress from their lives, they become very much calm, and they really slow down their lives. And in the case of Mary Baker Eddy and many of her followers, you find a clear explanation that if you reduce the level of stress in your life and you become more organized, you become very focused, you become very much positive, very much optimistic, it has a very positive impact on your health. And this is not because you become a Christian Scientist. It would happen anyway if you change your lifestyle and you change your mentality. So the link between being highly effective and religion is not a direct link. there is a link with stress reduction. There is a link with becoming optimistic, with becoming determined to improve your life. And this is a pattern that you find in hundreds of stories in history, but I don't think it can be linked with religion. Stress reduction is a major advantage, but it doesn't mean that you should become a follower of one of these religious movements.
Right. Well, okay, John. Well, thank you for that explanation. Obviously, I think we all accept that the power of belief is also a very strong influencer. And obviously, if someone has a very strong belief, then they can influence a change in some respect, can't they?
To a certain extent, because when you look at positive thinking that today is very prevalent as a philosophy, you have to see in which situations it works and in which situation it fails. Because if you go to the U.S., for instance, in the U.S. is something is a prevalent cultural movement, positive thinking. For most people, it's like a religion. It's like a fact. But when you look at details in the U.S., you have 50 million people taking medication against depression, stress, anxiety. Millions and millions of people are dependent on medication because they cannot cope with daily problems. And positive thinking is not helping them. So what is the answer? You find the answer when you look at the origins of positive thinking, which wasn't invented in the US, was invented in France in the 19th century by a pharmacist by the name Emile Coué. And Emile Coué, he kept very detailed statistics about positive thinking because he wanted to promote his pharmacy. He was a pharmacist in a small town. He took a course on hypnotism. He closed the pharmacy for a week and he went to take this course. And he started to practice suggestion, positive suggestion on his customers, trying to encourage them to take their medication. He painted very enthusiastic pictures of recovery, so that the patients would be very motivated to take the medication. And eventually he kept the statistics and he actually proved that people tend to recover much faster if they're highly motivated. But the trick is the following. They didn't recover just because they were motivated. They recovered because they were motivated to take the medication and to change their lifestyle. And Emile Coué was very conscious in his book and in his notes that positive thinking only works if it reinforces positive action. If you just take it in abstraction and you just become a very strong believer, but you don't link your beliefs to any positive action, it's a complete waste of time. And this is a big misunderstanding, and this is why you have so many people with depression and anxiety, because they hear about this positive thinking, they believe that it's some kind of magic, but there is no magic in the world. Positive thinking only works if you put it together with action.
Okay, I see, John. Now, I'd like to move on to a slightly different subject, which again comes up in your latest book, which is how to use disruptive forces for career success. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yes. What I've done in this chapter is to analyze one of the main disruptions that people suffer today in the 21st century, which is not very spectacular, but is very much widespread. And this is the case of people who are really stuck. They are stuck in their job, they're stuck in their profession, they're stuck in their relationships, they are stuck in their lifestyle, and they want to improve, and they do not dare to make any changes because their situation is very risky, and they know that if they start to change their circle of friends, or they start to change their job, they risk losing everything. And what I've done in this chapter is to actually show that when you're stuck in a situation that is undesirable, and to a certain extent, it's something, I mean, you cannot imagine yourself living the same life for the next 10 years or 20 years. The only way to go and to find improvement is to go through some disruptions. There is no way to escape a situation where you're full of constraints if you do not take some risk. Now, what I've done in this chapter is to explain with several examples how you can do that with minimum risk, because I don't share the philosophy which is now so prevalent that encourages people to do foolish things. Say, just do it, just do it, just do it. I think this is stupid. Many people find themselves in very risky situations. They lose their house, they lose their business, they lose their relationship, and I think this is very stupid. One of the best examples I found in history about how to get unstuck and to improve your life and to move to a different career, for instance, is the biography of Albert Schweitzer. And Schweitzer was a humanitarian, a very famous humanitarian in the 1950s and 1960s. And I don't know how many people are familiar with his biography, but it's very, very compelling. Because Schweitzer was a professor. He was a professor of theology in Strasbourg in France. He was quite established. He had a good salary. He had a circle of friends. He was very popular in the university, but he was very unhappy. He was stuck. He didn't like his life. He didn't like his activities. He wanted to do something else. He wanted to change his life radically. He wanted to move to Africa. He wanted to become a missionary. What I was saying is that Albert Schweitzer wanted to change his life in a very risky way because he wanted to go to Africa. And everybody told him he was crazy. The lesson from his life is very interesting because he did it in a way that almost eliminated the risk. And it's the following. When he told his friends that he wanted to quit his job and to do something completely different, to go to Africa, to become a missionary, they discouraged him to do it. They told him, if you go this way, you're going to lose everything. The guy was very clever. I mean, he wasn't stupid. He realized that he was basically destroying his whole career. So he took an approach of having a plan B, which is I think this is real genius because he decided to quit his job. He knew he would never be hired again at university if he quit his job, but still he did it. And he thought, if I lose everything, if I go to Africa and it becomes a disaster, if I go there and I become sick, what am I going to do? He developed this plan B, which is the following. He used to play music in the cathedral every weekend. He realized that if he lost everything, he could still make a living by teaching music or by playing music by giving concerts. So when he went to Africa to start his new career as a missionary, as a physician, he took with him a second-hand piano, an upright piano he bought very inexpensively. He practiced 1 hour a day. When he was in Africa, he was still practicing every day for an hour because he knew that this was his safety net. If he lost everything, he would still go back to Europe and make a living as a musician. And he did it several times. When he ran out of money, and he was in Africa running his small hospital, he went back to Europe repeatedly, and he earned money. He raised money for his hospital by giving concerts. So this approach is fantastic. If you're trying to change your life, if you're trying to change your career, take this approach of having a plan B. You can always fall back because it will reduce your level of stress. It will make you very self-confident, and then you can take enormous challenges like Schweitzer, who changed his life completely with very, very little risk. It's amazing how a person can really turn his life around without losing sleep, because Schweitzer was a very healthy, very, very calm personality. because he had this plan B. If he had done the whole adventure without having a backup approach, he would have been extremely stressed.
Right. Well, I do take your point there. That's a good success story, and as you say, it wasn't such a difficult approach to make a few changes in his life, was it?
No, the stories in this chapter, and the principle that you should not listen to this propaganda you see every day in the media, the just do it, go for it, because it encourages people to make foolish things, huh? And you see it's now almost a mania. You see people taking selfies in completely stupid, risky situations. You see people going on holidays to completely dangerous areas of the planet. And you see this mentality that risk does not matter. And this is very stupid. Take example, copy, imitate people who know how to do things. Don't listen to propaganda because you might destroy your life.
Right. Okay, John. Now, I'd like to ask you a different question here, which I prepared, which is, have you studied any of the lives of well-known geniuses, such as, well, I could mention Isaac Newton or Leonardo da Vinci, and obviously we also have Nikola Tesla, who was another great inventor, and Albert Einstein. What are your observations regarding people who are exceptionally gifted, who are, without doubt, geniuses, or, have achieved something really quite exceptional?
One of the main lessons is that you should not believe the exaggerations you see in the story. Because most of the names you mentioned, and I'm going to focus especially on Leonardo in the discussion, most of the names you mentioned, they did some things that are very extraordinary, but most of those people are not good examples of a successful lifestyle. If you take Leonardo, for instance, which nowadays I think in history, when you study history, you are presented Leonardo as one of the best geniuses in history because he could paint, he could invent, he was an inventor, he was an architect, he was a sculptor, so he did a lot of things. And everybody says, Leonardo da Vinci was a great genius. But when you look at his lifestyle and you look at the details, he was pretty much a disaster. The whole story is really blown up because Leonardo lived 67 years. When you look at what he produced in 67 years, most things are not really so impressive. Because as a painter, I think he produced about 15 paintings we have around the world, less than 15. Sculptures, he designed a few sculptures that in the end they were not produced because he only did the design. He made a lot of drawings for inventions, but the inventions were never put into practice. He designed several buildings, but the buildings were never built. So in the end, when you look at Leonardo, who lived 67 years, in the end of his life, he had to go to France because he was Italian. I mean, he was from the north of Italy. In the end, he went to France, trying to improve his life to get a better career. But when he died in France, he was living in a rented house. His possessions, when he died, they were limited to a few books, a little bit of money, very little, and a piece of land in Italy. So he was not financially successful. If you compare Leonardo, for instance, with Raphael, who died at 37, that's a real productive person because he painted hundreds and hundreds of square meters of the walls of the Vatican. He produced dozens and dozens of extraordinary paintings, portraits, landscapes. He lived only 37 years. So the idea of the genius, like Leonardo, is not a good example. I think it's much better to take your cues, to take your principles, to take your lifestyle from successful people who know how to use their talent, who know how to use the time productively, who know how to focus on a specific project and get it done. Because people like Leonardo, they look very impressive because they start a lot of things, but they never finish anything. Leonardo, can you imagine 67 years and he left 15 paintings? And people believe today that he was the greatest painter in history, and this is absolute nonsense. Leonardo has been blown out of proportion in the last 90 years. If you go to the 18th century, 17th century, nobody gave a damn about Leonardo. He was considered just another artist, a minor one, So you have to be very careful with geniuses because they look very impressive when you look at part of their lives. But when you look at the total picture, this is something that I always emphasize in my books. Look at the big picture. When you look at the big picture, you have to look at the habits, the attitude that make people very effective and very successful. And Leonardo did not have any of that.
Right. Well, that's an interesting observation. You could say something similar about Van Gogh, because he was never considered successful at the time that he was a painter during his lifetime. It was only much, much later that Van Gogh's paintings became admired and became famous, but that was long after his death, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, but the point of the stories of the book is that you should try to draw the benefits of your work to a great extent during your lifetime. I don't think it makes a lot of sense for most people to become famous after their death. It looks very impressive, but I think it's not a good model to imitate. I think the great examples I present in my books, they are people who find a way to become successful, to become happy within a lifetime, within 80 years, within 90 years. And these are the principles, these are the people you want to imitate. You do not want to imitate Leonardo, for sure.
Right. Well, okay, I take your point. I'm just trying to understand that, surely that the work that these people have left behind, there must be good reason why their work has been picked up and admired, even though it's been hundreds of years since Leonardo died. What is it that has made that work become so famous around the world? And as you say, it's when you look at Leonardo's life, it doesn't tally up with the amount of fame that he might have possibly had if his work had been picked up and admired by a sufficient number of people.
Yes, it was a coincidence at the beginning of the 20th century. If I remember correctly, one of his paintings got stolen for a while, and the painting came into the newspapers for a few weeks, and it became very famous. And this is why Leonardo, since the beginning of the 20th century, is known widely. But if you look at history books from the 19th century, 18th century, he does not appear as a great painter because he produced very few paintings. In the case of Van Gogh, for instance, I think it's a good approach. If you want to do something, just do a lot of it. Produce a lot of paintings. Van Gogh produced dozens and dozens of paintings. He was painting all the time. He was trying to sell them. And this is the way to do it. It is impossible to believe that someone like Leonardo, who produced so few paintings, could be regarded as a great artist or a great sculptor or a great architect. He was very original. He was very curious. He produced designs on all possible things, on inventions, on airplanes, wherever.
Yeah.
It's very weird. It's very nice to visit an exhibition about Leonardo, but you have to look at the figures. And the examples I present in my book, I want them to be practical. I want people to actually understand what they can imitate. If you look at Leonardo, it looks very interesting, but there is nothing to learn from him because in the end it was a disaster.
Right. Okay. Well, that's certainly something I didn't know, and obviously, I suppose it's the sort of thing you only find out when you dig a little deeper and do some research into it, like you've done. Now, something else that caught my eye about the book, you mentioned in one of the chapters, you talk about the Knights Templar. Now, obviously, the Knights Templar in their day were a very powerful group, and they, as far as I understand it, they amassed an absolute fortune. So, what was the significance of talking about the Knights Templar, and what are there any lessons to be learned about that?
Yes, the Knights Templar is a great example of structures that look very solid, but there is nothing behind. And you see today in the 21st century, you see these large companies that are very powerful, very impressive, and then they disappear. And I'm thinking now about Enron. Was a great bankruptcy a few years ago, and the Bank of Credit and Commerce, it also was wiped out within a few months. And these companies, they look very powerful, they look very impressive, like the Knight Templars. The Knight Templars, we're talking about the 12th century, 13th century. They were very powerful. They had 20,000 members, most of them from the aristocracy in different the countries of Europe. They had not only money, because they were also doing international finance. They don't have only money, but they had castles. They have large agricultural pieces of land around Europe. So they were very powerful, wealthy, but they disappeared within 2 weeks. The leaders of the Knights Templar, they were accused of under false charges. They were accused by the King of France. They were prosecuted and they were killed. And we are talking only about 6 people out of 20,000. They were taken down, and the rest of the organization collapsed overnight. The 20,000 people, despite the wealth, despite the castles, despite everything, they disappeared within 2 weeks. And this, how is possible? How is it possible that the Knights Templar, they look so impressive, they were warriors, they were trained to fight? How is it possible that something like Enron, something like the Bank of Credit and Commerce, they can go bust overnight and disappear? And the principle is always the same. It's the same principle that you find in people today. They are living their lives, they are having their jobs, they are doing their things, and then they get a heart attack. And they say, oh, my life was very good, I was doing fine until I had this heart attack. It's a bit like the Knights Templar. They look very powerful, but then they disappear overnight. And there is a fallacy behind this impression of stability, and it's the following: when you have an organization, you have a lifestyle, a series of habits, or the food you take, whether you have a life which is active or passive, wherever. When you have a situation that you are making yourself vulnerable, like the Knights Templar, the problem with the Knights Templar is that they have a lot of money, they had a lot of people, but the organization was massively ineffective. They had a huge overhead. The 20,000 members, most of them were bureaucrats. They only had less than 2,000 soldiers, and the soldiers, the knights, they were spread all around Europe, so they could actually not fight very effectively. So, like Enron, like all these companies, if they are not effective, if they are not strong, is just an image. It's just a myth. It's like the person who gets a heart attack and he says, I was doing fine. No, he was not doing fine. He had a very unhealthy lifestyle for 20 years, and then he got a heart attack. And this is what happened with the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar were extremely effective. They're extremely bureaucratic. They had half of the people doing something else. They were not warriors. They were doing only administration. The message from this chapter is that when you see this lifestyle of this organization, when they become extremely vulnerable because they are very ineffective and they are very unhealthy, they can be taken down very, very easily. The Knights Templar disappear in 2 weeks. People who live very unhealthy lifestyle, eventually they will get some kind of problem. They will get a heart attack. They will get lung cancer. They will get whatever. And they say, oh, I was doing fine until I got this problem. And this is a very, very dangerous mentality. When you look at history, you have to see that most of these problems are perfectly predictable. And if you have known the Knights Templar from inside, you would have seen that it was a very weak, very poor organization, poorly organized. They had money, but the money was wasted. They didn't use it properly. So you have to be very careful with your lifestyle, not to make yourself vulnerable like the Knights Templar, because eventually you will run the risk of having severe problems.
Right. Okay. Well, that certainly makes that story clear, much more clear about, as you say, that how they suddenly, apparently, just disappeared within a very short space of time. I'd like to move on to one of your other books now, which has the title Sequentiality, which you call The Amazing Power of Finding the Right Sequence of Steps. Now, could you just give us a few examples of that? Obviously, we won't go into too much about the book, but could you just give us a few examples of that process and how people actually made the discovery of how to make the right sequence of steps in their own lives?
Yes, and the main message from the book is that if you look at the stories of these people and you see how they actually get things done, you discover a pattern. And the pattern is that you have to do things in the right sequence. This is why I call the book Sequentiality, because I invented the word sequentiality. It's just that most of the time we tend to do things especially when we start a new venture, we start a new business, or we want to improve something. We do it in a very chaotic way. We try to reinvent the wheel. We try to improvise because we don't take the trouble to research. When you look at stories, and I present in the book dozens and dozens of stories in different areas, different centuries, how people get incredible things done with very few resources, and you see how they did. You see that in every story, every success story, there is a discovery of the right sequence of steps. And just to give you a couple of thoughts, very quickly, you take a look, for instance, at how they made the movie Casablanca. And Casablanca is a very famous movie from the 1940s with Humphrey Bogart. And what really is very impressive about this movie is that it was made very inexpensively. It looks very realistic. People love the movie. It's very compelling. And in the end, it was supposed to be one of these serious B movies with a low budget. They didn't expect the movie to be very successful. And what made the movie extremely compelling, and when you watch the movie, you don't realize how it's done, but what made the movie almost unique in this period of time is that it was filmed in sequence. That's why I put it in the book about sequentiality. Because what made the actors and the director very alert and very much consistent with the story is that everything in the story is almost true. And the actors, they were really discovering as they went along. If you look at the love scenes between Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, they look extremely realistic. Much more realistic than you find in the average movie, because they didn't know the end of the story. They were building the story as they went along, because the director, the producer of the movie, was Wallace. He was an American producer. By the time he was starting to shoot the movie, he had not decided about the end. So he didn't know whether Humphrey Bogart was going to go away with Ingrid Bergman, whether they're going to be killed, whether they're going to separate, whether Ingrid Bergman was going to leave her husband behind. He didn't know. And they shot the movie sequence by sequence in order. And this is something that today in the 21st century you never see anymore. Because nowadays they try to put together the sequences with the actors, and then they make the rest of the movie by using simulation, by using software, by using backgrounds, and it loses a lot of force. What you see when you try to find the right sequence of steps little by little, like people do in real life, and I present in the book dozens of examples in different areas. And this is why when I present the stories in the book, I try to show that one of the patterns of people who find the right sequence of steps is that you really have to go through the steps. You cannot expect to get something done in a very complex way when you don't get it started, when you don't get through the movie. And as you are going through the movie, you find the best way to actually fit the end. And this is in all the stories I present in the book. I present the story for explorers, artists, industrialists, naturalists. I present a lot of stories. You see people that they want to do something with their lives, but they discover the right sequence of steps very, very often because they get on the way, and then they start experimenting with little changes. And the movie Casablanca is a great example because you see how they actually put it together by following the right sequence. And they shot sequence after the other. So during the whole period they shot the movie, was a few weeks, all the actors were together. This is the right way. If you want to improve something, you have to get in the way, you have to get started, and then you will discover the sequence little by little.
Right. Would you say that there's a certain amount of trial and error involved in that then? What would your view on that be?
Well, what happens is that as you improve your skills when you're going through the process, you narrow down the choices, because in the end you learn what doesn't work. And what happened when they shot Casablanca, at the beginning they have a lot of options, and they knew that within the 2 weeks of the production they could go in different directions. But as they started to run out of time, because they had a very tight budget, in the end the ending became obvious. And it was only the very last day that the producer wrote the final sentence of Casablanca, and they improvised the setting, and they made this scene in the airport where Humphrey Bogart is saying goodbye to Ingrid Bergman. And in the end, it looked like a genius ending because it's so spectacular. But when you see how they made the movie, in the end, it became self-evident. And this is one of the patterns you see in sequentiality. When people go through the process, in the end, the solution becomes almost self-evident because they narrow down the choices, because they eliminate the mistakes as they go.
Right. Well, that's obviously an important concept, and that would also apply, obviously, to success in business, I would have thought.
Yeah, I can give you a great example from the 19th century, which is a very famous in the U.S. His name was Alan Pinkerton, and he was the founder of a company, the Pinkerton Detectives. And you see in movies from the early 1930s, 1940s, they appear very often. And they still exist today. I think it's a very, very large company. And very few people know that Pinkerton, he came from the United States. He was a very poor tradesman in London, barely making a living, and decided to emigrate to the United States. And when he left to the States, he didn't have a clear profession. He tried different things, and eventually, when he was in one of his trades, because he was working as a laborer, he was doing different jobs. Eventually, he found himself involved in the capture of a criminal. And this is something because he was a very well-connected man because of his job. Eventually, this little detail helped him to get a job in the police department, a very low job because he was only an assistant detective. And eventually, he managed to turn this little job into a huge company. And the way he did is fascinating because Pinkerton at the beginning he didn't have an idea to become a businessman. He just found the sequence of steps by getting into the job himself, and by trying to put together opportunity after opportunity. And the way Pinkerton became a great entrepreneur, and eventually he became very famous, is fascinating because when he was in the police, he realized that there were some problems with the coverage of the police because they couldn't cover the crimes between different states of the United States. So it was very easy in the 19th century to rob a bank and to move to another state because then the police could not cross the state line, and they did it all the time. So Pinkerton realized there was a market opportunity. He quit his job at the police and he started a small agency to protect the railroad so that he could put policemen in the trains. And he started to get different customers in different states. He started to recruit people. And then he realized that the only way to get publicity, hired a few writers to publish detective novels with his name. So he started to publish novels about Pinkerton detectives. And the novels, of course, they were fake. They were just publicity stunts. But he realized that with a very, very small budget, he was able to reach thousands of people. And within 20 years, he built one of the largest private police forces in the world. And the story is fascinating because Pinkerton only found the sequence of steps while he went through it, because he took opportunity after opportunity, and when he was in his next step, he looked ahead and said, what is the next problem? And if he had not left London to go to the US, he wouldn't have got a job. If he hadn't not found a job in the police, he would not found the opportunity to actually sell the services. And when you look at his career, it looks very impressive that he became a millionaire. But when you look at the details, you see this pattern of finding the sequence by looking at the opportunities on each steps.
I see. Well, again, that's a very interesting story there. Now, can we move on to another one of your books, which it's entitled Thriving in Difficult Times? And it actually looks at the ancient Greeks and the history of Greece. What would you say is there to be learnt from looking at the ancient Greek culture? What are the practical things that we can learn and maybe apply from studying that ancient culture?
Well, to look at ancient Greece 25 years ago, is the few characteristics of their culture that made them very successful. Because at the time of the ancient Greece, you had many other cultures in the Mediterranean. You have the Phoenicians, you have the early Romans, you have Carthaginians, so you have many different, the Persians, of course, and the only culture that became super successful was the Greek. All the rest, they disappeared. And the Greek continued to expand decade after decade, and they became a very important force. And eventually, when the Romans took over Greece, actually they became highly influenced by the Greek culture. And how did they do it? It's fascinating because there was not an empire like you see in the ancient Rome when they had conquered other countries. The Greeks, most of the time, what they did was to have a very open mentality to take advantage of opportunities. So instead of trying to conquer other countries, what they did was to start small settlements and to trade with other countries. They were very open-minded concerning religion, concerning different habits, concerning foreigners. At the time of great splendor in ancient Greece in the 5th century before Christ, 50% of the population in Athens, they were foreigners, 50%. And this is astonishing. And the ancient Greeks, they didn't have any problem to deal with people of different countries, different cultures, different languages, different religions. They didn't have this mentality we have today in some countries where people are afraid of foreigners. They realized that they could live much better by having open trade, by having open borders, by trying to collaborate with other people than by actually conquering them. And they became extremely wealthy by taking this approach. So when you find ruins of Greek settlements in different countries of the Mediterranean, it is because they opened trading posts. They didn't want to conquer other countries; they just wanted to trade with them. And this is one of the great messages. You will be able to thrive much better in the difficult times when you try to open different areas in your life, to learn different skills, to try to move and keep the door open to different opportunities. So what I've done in the book is to take dozens and dozens of stories from ancient Greek, from successful Greek people in different areas, and try to learn principles. The book emphasizes about the learnings, the teachings from Hippocrates, who was an ancient Greek physician, because they also developed a very healthy lifestyle, a low-cost lifestyle, thanks to Hippocrates. So I have also presented in the book the principles that use in ancient Greece to keep healthy for many years. Just to give you an idea, for instance, Hippocrates, he lived 90 years, which is a very respectable age at the time when most people in the Mediterranean, they have a life expectancy of only 52 years.
Right. Well, yes, obviously Hippocrates was really a pioneer of health and healing, wasn't he? And he learned about the power of herbs and the power of certain foods to really aid in the healing process in the body, didn't he?
Yeah, and the lessons we got from ancient Greece is in this research, in this thriving in difficult times, they are very easy to implement. For instance, now we're talking about Hippocrates. One of his recommendations is that people should not exert themselves too much, because he realized that in the ancient Greeks there were sports competitions every 4 years, and they have these Olympic games, but this is not the lifestyle of the normal Greek. They didn't spend their evenings running around what they do in many countries. People run every day for an hour or something like this. This is very unhealthy, actually. And Hippocrates realized that for most people, this was not the right lifestyle. He recommended to exercise moderately, to have a very balanced diet, but he actually recommended that people should not go to extremes. And I fear that today we have this fashion of extreme sports in many countries, that people are actually exerting themselves too much. The number of accidents is huge, and it's not a good lifestyle. It's very interesting to read Hippocrates because he had the experience of hundreds of years of Persian and Greek medicine, and he managed to develop a very healthy lifestyle, very similar to what today in the 21st century you have in holistic medicine.
Right. Well, that is interesting, of course, and we are learning, of course, that many of these natural cures can be very effective, and without some of the side effects of these modern drugs. So, yes, there are certainly lessons to be learnt by looking into how some of these ancient cultures used to live, and I'm sure that we will continue to make discoveries on that front. Now, another thing which you mention in the book is you mention the phrase artificial optimism, and that caught my eye as being something a little bit unusual. Could you explain what you mean by artificial optimism, and what can we learn from that?
Yes, one worst strategy used in life is to become self-suggested and to get extremely arrogant, to become a bit like living in the Matrix, where people just tell themselves every day, I'm the best, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. And it becomes sort of a very unrealistic mentality. People become super arrogant, super aggressive. You see this very often in countries that people are extremely aggressive, they have extremely bad manners. And in the end, it's very counterproductive, because when you look in history and you look at people who are really successful, most of the time they are not super optimistic. They are not super cheerful. They are not super happy. They just they get things done. The happiness is inside. They don't have to convince anyone else that they're super happy. So we have today in the 21st century this exaggerated idea that if you are an extrovert and you are always very aggressive, very assertive, very optimistic, superficially optimistic, because for most of these people there is nothing behind, it looks very compelling, very interesting. But when you look at the real stories in history, it's very rare. Most of the super successful people in history, super happy people, they are very much low key. They are modest. They are hardworking. They follow their careers or their professions. They follow their goals, but they don't waste their time trying to appear super optimistic. And in many cases, the people were super low key, super modest, and they still became successful, because the conclusion from the research is that this superficial optimism is a complete waste of time. You just spend your energies trying to look cheerful and trying to look positive. I think the energies would be much better spent, much better devoted, if you actually did the work and you actually get things done, instead of trying to convince other people that you are super cheerful.
Right. I see what you mean by that. Yeah. I mean, obviously you've done a huge amount of research into this, and looking into a lot of history books and texts about different people, or biographies about people. Now, if you could condense what you've learnt in those years of research, and just try and summarize some of the main points which you think would be useful to people to apply in their lives, what sort of guidance do you think you could just give to people?
Okay, I'm going to give two recommendations that I think are super important, and these are two major lessons I drawn from history. First one when you have to make major decisions regarding your career, your health, your lifestyle, your goals, you have to think in terms of a lifetime. You're going to live 80, 90 years, maybe 100 years if you're lucky. Today in the 21st century, there are thousands of people who become very, very old. And the right way to approach adversity, to approach problems, to approach situations that are very disruptive is to think in terms of a lifetime. Don't try to hasten your decisions. Don't try to rush things too much. Don't think only short term, like most people, that they panic completely when they're facing a problem because they think they're going to die tomorrow. They think they're going to die in a few months, and this is completely unrealistic. If you get fired from a job or you get a divorce and you have 50 decades or 60 decades ahead of you, there is no reason to panic. There is no reason to become stressed. You have plenty of time to rebuild your life. Think in terms of a lifetime. You will reduce your levels of stress. You will become much more effective, and you will be able to make decisions very quickly that for other people become almost impossible, because you will have this perspective of decades that is absolutely necessary to have the ability to make good decisions. And the second piece of advice I want to mention is taken from the life of Rubens, who was a very great artist in the 17th century. And Rubens became super successful as a painter, not because he was very talented, but because he was able to imitate, copy people who were successful. When Rubens started his career, he realized very quickly that it was very difficult to make a living as an artist. So what he did was to go to Italy for a few months. He spent 6 months in Florence and Venice. He took a close look at how the Italian artists were creating a marketing system, were finding customers for their paintings, were getting commissions. And then he returned to his city in Antwerp in Belgium, and he copied the marketing systems they were using in Italy. And he became super successful, while most artists in the 17th century were literally starving. So the message is very clear. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Whatever your problems are, whatever your situations are, you can find in history very, very easily. You can find examples of people who have solved the problem already. And you can use these examples to improve your life very quickly. And Rubens, within a couple of years, he built a very effective marketing machine in Antwerp. He got dozens and dozens of commissions. He hired people to make the paintings. He created a money machine. While all other artists in the area, they were barely making a living. And the lesson is very clear. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Look into history. Look at examples to learn from. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's much better and much easier to copy, to imitate people who found already the key to success and happiness.
Right, that certainly makes a lot of sense, John. And I hope that the listeners have certainly found this conversation very interesting and stimulating. I know I've certainly found some interesting points in what you said. So I think that's about it then. So I'd like to say a big thank you to everybody for listening in, and we'll speak to you next time. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, sir.
Thank you.